A question I frequently get asked is, what Bible should I use? It's a great question because there are a lot of Bibles out there. The simplest answer is whatever Bible you have in front of you is a great place to start. You don't have to go out and buy a whole new Bible if you already have one on your shelf. However, the one on your shelf might not be working for you. So, what Bible should you get? First, let's talk about why there are so many different versions of the Bible on a bookstore shelf. The Old Testament was written in ancient forms of Hebrew, and the New Testament was written in an ancient form of Greek called Koine. If you speak and read those ancient languages, congratulations, you don't need a translation. But if you're like the rest of us and you don't speak or read those languages, then you're going to need an English translation. And translation isn't cut and dry, especially when you're translating from an ancient language into a modern one. It's an art. There are different ways to translate things from one language to another language. Different translations tend to work off of one basic question. Do we translate literal word for word, or do we translate more idea for idea? Let me explain. If you knew someone who was going to be in a theatrical production and it was opening night, you might say to them, break a leg. That's a common thing in our culture for people to say in those situations. But if you travel to another part of the world and you look in the dictionary, their dictionary, and you find out how you might say break a leg, and you go and you say that to them, they will probably at least look at you very weird. If they don't get offended, you want me to break a leg? Because to them, that doesn't make sense at all. Break a leg is an idiom. It works in our language and in our culture. So imagine that someone was going to translate what you said, break a leg, into another language for a vastly different culture. They would have two different options. They could translate it word for word, break a leg, and expect the person reading it or hearing it to do the work in figuring out what it means. Or they could do the work for them and translate it as good luck, which is essentially what it means in our cultural context. This is the work that biblical translators do all day long. Do we do the work for them and tell them exactly what it means, or do we give it to them literally and we let them do their own work in figuring it out? The one kind of translation is usually called literal, and the other kind is usually called dynamic. And then some translations try and work somewhere in the middle, sometimes opting for word, and sometimes going more thought for thought, depending on the context. A popular dynamic translation of the Bible is The Message by Eugene Peterson. The Message is so idea for idea that it is usually described as a paraphrase. The New Living Translation is another common example. The Good News Bible is another. These versions are very readable. In fact, in some of them, you might forget that you're even reading the Bible. They just feel so modern and fresh. More in the middle versions would be the English Standard Version of the Bible, the ESV, or the New International Bible, the NIV, the New Jerusalem Bible, or the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, the NRSV. The NRSV, the New Revised Standard, is the one that is most read from the front of churches in mainline Protestant churches. These translations are readable and, for the most part, very faithful to what the ancient texts actually say, which means that they're not as readable and accessible as the Message or the NLT. If you want to go to a real extreme literal word for word translation of the Old Testament, you could find a copy of John Goldingay's The First Testament. If you want a similarly literal copy of the New Testament, you could look up David Bentley Hart's The New Testament. These are scholars who really, really went literal in their translations. Even the places where the original authors made a grammatical error, they leave the grammatical error in the text. One other thing to consider when translating an ancient text like the Old and New Testaments, there's no way to do so without bringing our own biases and theological beliefs into it. So all translations have some sort of bent to them. The English Standard Version and the New International Version are both conservative evangelical translations, and you can see that in how they choose to translate sometimes. The New Jerusalem Bible is thoroughly Roman Catholic, and you can see that bias in how they translate some things. The NRSV is very mainline Protestant, and you can see that too. You are never going to find an unbiased translation, but it's helpful to be aware of who did the work and just to know that going in. For me, what I like to do is I like to use different versions. When I'm preparing a sermon, I might read the same passage in as many as 8 different versions. In my own daily devotions, I'll use one version one year, and then I'll use another version the next year. That way I don't get in a rut, and I get to read this book year in and year out, but it still feels fresh. One question I frequently get is, what about the King James Bible? Like, isn't that the gold standard? So yes, it was a triumph when it was first put together. Just amazing. And it has issues. The translators who were absolutely breaking new ground in their day were using original sources that we would never use for translation work today. Archaeologists have found older manuscripts in the last 400 years. These older manuscripts are more faithful to the originals. The translators of the King James Bible just didn't have access to these better materials. And then there's the issue of the archaic language. It's hard to read. We don't talk like that anymore. So not only are we having to try and figure out what a 2,000 or 3,000-year-old text is saying to us, but we're also having to deal with Shakespearean English that just isn't spoken anymore. So do I use the King James Version? Of course I do. It's beautiful. It's lovely. But I use it in short spurts, and I always have a more modern translation right next to it. If I had to suggest a few solid and generally readable versions of the Bible to you, I'd say the English Standard and the New Revised Standard, which just came out with a brand new and updated version, or maybe the New Living Translation. If you wanted something very modern and very readable, I would say give the Message a try. And if you felt adventurous, you could look at one of the more scholarly word-for-word versions that I mentioned earlier. One more thing. Today, you can go physical book with like a cover and paper pages, or you can go electronic, like a Kindle version or an app. What's better? So that is up to you. Do you read lots of Kindle books? Do you do a lot of reading in apps? Then that might be best for you. Do you just generally prefer physical books? Then do that. Again, I use both. When I'm preparing a sermon, I'll oftentimes have a bunch of books laid out on a table in front of me. Sometimes I like being able to write notes in the margins or flip from one page to another. But oftentimes in my personal devotions and daily prayers, honestly, I use my phone. My phone is always with me. I don't have to go, oh no, I left my Bible at home, or oh no, I put my Bible in checked luggage. No, my phone is always with me. And I have several versions loaded up on my Kindle app. Honestly, the most important thing is to read it. If the translation works for you, great. If the format works for you, great. I'd recommend mixing things up sometimes, but just like photographers will say that the best camera is the one you have with you, the best Bible is the one you have with you.